Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Today, President Yoon Suk Yeol embarked on a 5-day visit to New York to attend the UN General Assembly. During a general debate, leaders of the world are expected to deliver speeches, and President Yoon is not an exception. He will express concerns over strengthening ties between North Korea and Russia and deliver Seoul's plan to enhance its contribution in the global arena as befits South Korea's growing international status. The trip to New York is expected to be a very busy one, with President Yoon also holding at least 30 bilateral summits on the sidelines of the assembly. What will be the highlights of the high-level week of the 78th UN General Assembly, and what can we expect from President Yoon's speech there? For more on this, we have invited Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. Welcome, Professor Kelly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi. And we also have Professor Kim Jae-chun, who is the Dean of Seogang Graduate School of International Studies as well. Now, good to see you, Professor Kim. All right, Professor Kim, first question to you. A week of high-level discussion at the 78th session of the UN General Assembly begins today, with the highlight a general debate taking place the next day. Now, historically, what role have General Assembly sessions played?
Well, the United Nations is still the most important international organization in the world, and the UN General Assembly is the most representative organ of the United Nations. So the role of UNGA, General Assembly, is to discuss and debate, and if possible, to make recommendations on some of the most pressing international issues. The issue can be security issues, such as the arms deal between North Korea and Russia. It can be developmental issue. Usually, the debate that is taking place there attracts significant attention, significant international attention. So during the debate, member states leaders, they'll have the opportunities to express their views on major international issues. So this year, I think there's going to be a heated debate on this illicit arms deal between North Korea and Russia and its illegality.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, U.S. President Joe Biden is going to deliver a speech on Tuesday during the high-level general debate as well. What is he expected to include in his speech?
Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of it is going to be, as was just mentioned, a lot of it's going to be about the Russian-North Korea, the Russian-North Korea deal. I think that's really going to sort of take over actually a lot of Yoon's trip, because if it really does look like the Russians and the North Koreans are moving together in a pretty serious way, and Kim, this was his longest trip, right, I think since 2011, I believe the longest ever of his tenure. I mean, it looks like they're making a really big effort to sort of double down, and so I think, at least for the Koreans, I think that this is going to be like the big story, right? I mean, how do we sort of block, how do we prevent this from becoming like a real sort of axis of authoritarianism or something along those lines? And then beyond that, I think, Biden may go off and talk about climate change and things like that, but I think the core of it is going to be the North Korea Russia stuff that we've been discussing here.
Right. Now, not just Biden, Professor Kim, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to show up in person at the U.S. annual gathering of world leaders as well. And he is also going to go to Washington, D.C. to talk with President Joe Biden. What does his visit to the U.S. mean this time around?
President Zelensky has been very busy on the world stage, and the objective is to elicit support for Ukraine, moral support as well as physical support, material support. I don't think North Korea's military support for Russia is going to be a game changer there, but still Russia will be in a better position to hold on to their line of defense. It is expected that Ukraine will launch a second counter offensive, but with ammo from North Korea, Russians can defend themselves better. If that is the case, the war will drag on indefinitely. The war has already morphed into a war of attrition, and Ukraine is a smaller country than is Russia, so the longer the war drags on, the more difficult it could get for Ukrainians. Sure, there is flagging support from the West, But from the perspective of Ukrainians and from the perspective of Zelensky, it is really important to mobilize continuous and unrelenting support from the international community, and most importantly, from the United States.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, as we have keep talking about this, the key of the heated debate would be Kim-Putin summit that has recently taken place. And the U.S., as Blinken said, is looking to make sure it can impose costs and consequences. Could any noteworthy effective measures against North Korea and Russia's potential violations of the UNSC resolutions be discussed?
Yeah, I think that's actually going to be one of the big things that's going to be discussed by both the Americans and the Koreans, right? Again, it's sort of as our discussion is headed here, I think this is going to be a big element of both the Yoon and the Biden speech. The sanctions on North Korea have been voted on repeatedly at the UN level, I believe 9 times, and they were all unanimous. I mean, this is something that's pretty core. If you want the UN Security Council to be an international lawmaking body, then enforcing sanctions on North Korea is actually pretty important because there's been so much attention on it. And the Russians are now moving towards an open violation of that. I mean, this is a pretty major challenge, I would argue. I understand, I mean, North Korea is sort of a small country and lots of other issues out there in the world, but I mean, this is actually a pretty major violation. Russia is a permanent veto holding power on the Security Council. It's one of the P5. It's, at least until the last year or so with the war, it's been considered a great power in international politics, and it's now behaving in a way that's really, really irresponsible, right? I mean, it's just flying right in the face of international law. The Russians have been sort of cheating on the sanctions and looking the other way for a while. But I mean, this is sort of like open, blatant violation. And I really wonder what the Americans and other U.S. partners, South Korea, Japan, the Europeans are going to do, because this is so obvious, right? We expect this kind of behavior from the North Koreans, but not really from the Russians. I have the feeling that, if Putin goes through with this, I mean, the sanctions on Russia, which are part of the Ukraine war, will probably tighten at some point. I wonder if we're going to kick the Russians out of the SWIFT system. I mean, that would be a huge step. I'm not sure how much more we can sanction North Korea, right? I mean, we all know the real issue, I think, with North Korean sanctions is enforcement rather than sort of layering on more punishment. I think the real issue is, how do you punish Russia? How do you punish a country that is as large as Russia? It's still a really big economy. A lot of countries have lent money to it, right? We're not fully comfortable expelling it from the banking system, right? We do think that there's got to be some way to reintegrate Russia in the future. We don't want a power with that many nuclear weapons being excluded from world politics forever. That's really, really risky. And so I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. I think that's going to be the real trick for Biden and U.S. allies generally, is how do we punish the Russians in such a way that's not so extreme that it provokes some kind of massive backlash. But on the other hand, we've got to get the Russians staying behind the sanctions, right? If you want the UN to be meaningful, then, you got to stand behind the sanctions for which we have voted. And that's the real trick. I'm just not sure how the Americans are going to thread that needle.
Right, I see. So the whole point will be on how Russia could be punished by the global society. Now, Professor Kim, I'd like to ask you about North Korea and Russia's stance at the meeting. Who from each country is expected to deliver speeches, and what might they say?
I don't know. I honestly don't know who to speak for Russia and North Korea. I know that Vladimir Putin is not coming. Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov, that's his name, right? He is meeting with China today. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi today. So I don't think Lavrov is coming either. In case of North Korea, maybe their ambassador to the United Nations may speak, but it's still up in the air. Transparency is lacking in these totalitarian countries. What would they speak? Speakers from both countries, no matter who they will be, they will try to defend their position, their recent moves, saying that their cooperation is not in violation of the UN Security Council resolution. Their cooperation will take place within the boundary of the UN Security Council resolution. And they'll probably say that they have no option but to strengthen their cooperation, because the United States and South Korea and also Japan, these countries are trying to encircle them, their usual excuses.
All right, so we'll just have to wait and see who from each country delivers a speech and what they're going to say. Now, Professor Kelly, let's also tap on China. So instead of the country's most senior diplomat Wang Yi, China's Vice President Huan Zheng is to attend UN General Assembly session. What does this mean, and what is China's view of the current strengthening of ties between Pyongyang and Moscow?
Right. So I think the fact that the Chinese and the Russians aren't really sending people very high up indicates how much the Russians and the Chinese actually think about the UN system, which is to say not a whole lot, right? That if it comes to sort of choosing between their national interests, fairly narrowly defined, and supporting international law, the sanctions regime on North Korea, they're going to choose their national interests, which in this case is that everybody, these three countries, North Korea, Russia, and China, all want Russia to win the Ukraine war, right? I mean, it's pretty clear now that that's what this is. I think that's where this is evolving, right? I mean, the globe is sort of splitting along the lines of this war, and that is, I think, why you're seeing, this sort of non-participation at the UN. Right, in the long term, I think for China, right, I think the Chinese, as I was saying, I think the Chinese want the Russians to win the war in part because that sets a precedent for China should it want to move on Taiwan in the future. But I think more importantly that if China is going to have a powerful partner in Russia to sort of challenge the American-led order, right, they need the Russians to win, right? The Chinese don't want to tie themselves to a loser, right? But the Chinese are sort of wary about supporting the Russians too much because that would cut off their access to Western markets, right? But you are getting this kind of like vague sort of axis or collaboration, if you will, between China, Russia, and North Korea, possibly Iran, right? Certainly the Biden administration has emphasized that a lot. But I mean, the Chinese are in the trickiest position, right? Because the Chinese have a pretty deep economic relationship with the West, which these other powers don't. The Russians had that 2 years ago, but that's over. Russia's kind of been expelled for a while, right? But China, it's really tricky, right? If the Chinese come out and openly support North Korean nuclearization or the Russian invasion, right, that will lead to a cessation of China's market access, which they need to grow. And so I think that's why the Chinese have been so quiet on the war, right? The war is the biggest thing in international politics right now. And the Chinese are barely saying anything about it, right? And the reason they're doing it is because, they want the Ukrainians to win, or the Russians to win, but they don't want to say that to the West because they need our market access, right? So they're in this weird position and they're basically not saying anything, right? Which is bizarre, but I think that sort of illustrates how China has like one foot in each camp. It's kind of a tangle.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Kim, moving on to President Yoon's visit to New York. So he is expected to use his upcoming address at the General Assembly to send a message about strengthening ties between North Korea and Russia. How do you expect the message's tone to be?
But I expect President Yoon to use the strongest language possible to condemn both countries, both Russia and North Korea. The venue here is the United Nations General Assembly, and as Professor Kelly just mentioned, one of the permanent member countries of the UN Security Council is trying to violate the UN Security Council resolution that they voted for. So what better way to condemn Russia than to take advantage of this venue, UN venue here, which is UN General Assembly. President Yoon will also impart a very strong message to North Korea as well. Your aggression here will only strengthen ROK-US alliance. It will only strengthen trilateral security cooperation between South Korea, the US, and then Japan. And in addition to these messages of warning, I think President Yoon will also talk about South Korea's global pivot state diplomacy, how South Korea can contribute to the peace and also prosperity of the world.
Right, I see. We're going to talk about the details that will be included in the President Yoon's speech. But before that, Professor Kelly, the Yoon administration underscored how South Korea is considering individual measures Seoul can take on its own, along with multilateral measures it could take with key allies such as Washington and Tokyo. What could those measures be?
Yeah, when it comes to the North Koreans, I'm not sure that there's too much more that we can do, right? I mean, you can always pass more sanctions. You can always sort of try to target specific North Koreans. That's sort of something that we've been experimenting with in the last few years. But of course, North Korea's league doesn't travel much. It's hard to get to their monies, which are tucked away in Russian and Chinese banks and stuff like that. I think that the tougher issue for South Korea in the future is going to be responding to Russia, right? If the Russians really do give the North Koreans a serious technological step up on things like missiles, planes, tanks, submarines, right? If actually, we don't know yet, but if the Russians actually come through on this stuff, that could actually be a pretty serious deal for South Korean security, right? The Yoon people are trying to signal that. And there, I think the South Koreans really do have some levers, most importantly, which is that South Korea and Russia still have a trade-in relationship, and the South Koreans could sever that, right? This is something that previous ROK President Moon Jae-in was unwilling to do, right? Your viewers may recall that the initial South Korean response to the war was sort of like, this isn't really our business, and whatever, we still want to export cars and whatnot to the Russians. And then sort of came the sort of pressure from the rest of the world, and the South Koreans kind of backed off. And the rest of the world has slowly been delinking from Russia to punish it for its behavior. And I think the South Koreans could do that. And I think if the South Koreans did that, that would sort of get to this question of South Korean status and stuff like that. It would actually look like South Korea had sort of a values-driven diplomacy rather than being sort of mercantile. You know, we'll just sell stuff to any despot in the world, right? And I think the Yoon people really grasp that in a way that previous ROC presidents have not. That's why the Yoon president, I think President Yoon likes to be around the Japanese and the Americans and the Europeans, because it feels like that South Korea is sort of part of this larger liberal democratic family. And right now, for the liberal democratic community in the world, the big issue is Ukraine. And I think the South Koreans are slowly coming around on that, and you're going to see that probably in the South Korean response. If the Russians give away something really serious, I think that the South Koreans are going to sort of lower the axe on the trading relationship, which a lot of other countries have done. So I'm not actually sure that it's such a big deal at this point, but I think that's probably what's going to happen.
Right, I see. I see your point how Russia, and responding to Russia could be the biggest challenge South Korea might have to deal with. Now, Professor Kim, so let's move on to President's details that might be included. The President is expected to have how government is planning to contribute to bridging global gaps. And given that President Yoon pledged contributions for the green transition and also for Ukraine's recovery during the recent G20 meeting, it seems the Yoon administration is showing how South Korea can contribute more to global society. How do you see such efforts?
But I see them positively. I think of these efforts of South Korea very highly. South Korea, I mean, think about it. South Korea now is one of the richest countries in the world, one of the strongest countries. 70 years ago, South Korea was one of the most impoverished countries in the world, but we grew this fast due in large part to the handsome support from the international community, from other countries. So I think now it's about time for South Korea to give back. You know, it's our moral obligation. And too long, South Korea's diplomatic vision had stayed on the Korean Peninsula affairs and on Northeast Asian affairs. I think it's time for South Korea to expand the diplomatic horizon and engage in the world more proactively. That I think is what South Korea's Yoon government's global pivot state diplomacy is all about.
Professor Kim, do you believe such contributions could really help South Korea to become a global pivotal state?
Well, I think so. Yeah, it'll all add up. So eventually, it'll augment South Korea's soft power capital, in which case it'll come back to South Korea as more tangible benefits.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, South Korea is also going to play its role as a non-permanent member of the UNSC for 2024 to 2025, and President Yoon's speech is going to include that as well. What role could South Korea play in the global arena as a non-permanent member?
Yeah, I think actually Dr. Kim sort of put his finger on it right there, right? That South Korea can sort of do more than just be sort of this export power, right? That South Korea is now a pretty wealthy state, right? I believe the South Korean economy is sort of the 11th largest in the world. I should add in passing, by the way, it's larger than the Russian economy. So when people sort of worry in South Korea, oh, we're going to lose this trade relationship with Russia, it's actually, South Korea is actually bigger than Russia now in terms of economic product. And so I think this is sort of a time when, again, I think the Yoon people really want this. This is a time when South Korea can step forward and say, you know, look, our foreign policy is about more than just selling like refrigerators or whatever, right? That we really want to go off and make a stand about, you know, climate change or North Korea or proliferation or, you know, democracy and human rights and things like that, right? And I think the Yoon people really want to do this, and I would imagine that these are the kinds of things that are going to be emphasized. Now, particularly for the South Koreans, what that's probably got to mean is always it's got to be North Korea, right? I mean, the South Koreans are really worried about North Korean nuclear missilization, right? That's one of the reasons why we have the sanctions, is to keep the North Koreans from sort of running away with this sort of spiraling program. But, you know, as was mentioned before, again, by Dr. Kim, right, I think the South Koreans, particularly this government, wants a sort of larger vision, right? Sort of like, what role can South Korea play on other kinds of pressing issues? And there's certainly lots of them out there. You know, climate change is a big one, right? That's an obvious one. You know, human rights and refugees and stuff like that. I mean, there are all kinds of issues out there where South Korea can sort of take a stand. And but if I had to guess, for the Yoon people, I would say it's going to be sort of like values, democracy, and things like that, because the Yoon people have been hinting at that for so long, right? You know, Yoon going to NATO and talking to the Europeans and talking to Biden and having the meeting with the Japanese and all that at Camp David. All of that is sort of circled around this idea that South Korea is going to start including liberal democratic rhetoric into its foreign policy, right? It's going to be, we're going to have more than just sort of exports, it's going to be values too. And I think that's great, actually. I think it's, you know, South Korea is a pretty wealthy place and can sort of do more than just be an exporter. So it's nice to see, I think.
All right, I see your point. Now, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Professor Kim. So during the visit to New York, President Yoon will hold bilateral talks with leaders from at least 30 countries as well. Which meeting might be the most noteworthy to take a closer look at?
I don't know. I think every bilateral summit is important. I think, you know, they will all add up. You know, President Yoon is portraying himself as the #1 salesperson of South Korea. I think he has lived up to that nickname. I think the objective of these bilateral summits is to sort of promote South Korea's sales diplomacy, you know, economic diplomacy, if you will. And also, they are also to elicit support for Pusan Expo in Pusan, where Professor Kelly lives in now.
Right.
All right, I see.
Right. We need the expo. We need the expo down here, man.
All right.
You got that right, yeah.
All right. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Kim and Professor Kelly, for your insights and time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.